6 in a 6-foot town.
Welcome in, everybody. So great to be with you on a Monday morning. We have another busy week ahead of us, and Christmas is just 8 days away. So by this time next week, it will be Christmas Eve. Lots to keep on our mind. And you know, holy cow, there was so much that went on this weekend. I mean, news story after news story after news story. And I tried to select the ones that I think are the biggest news stories, but, you know, we're not even going to come close to touching everything this particular week just because there was so much that happened over the weekend. And this is a really bad time for the turkey coma to be affecting all of us, because we all know it starts about Thanksgiving. It really lasts until a little bit after New Year's. People are in the turkey coma right now, and just the average person is not paying attention to the news. And that is a real shame, because there is so much important stuff going on right now that you need to know about. And that's why we're here. We appreciate you being here, and we're going to do the best that we can to keep those of you who are that are really in tune with this whole thing. We're going to try to keep you abreast of the situation, try to keep you aware of what is going on at all times. So much news to get into, so we are going to dive straight in. A Texas judge has stricken down Obamacare in its entirety. Now, it's not that uncommon, and we've had this happen before, where judges would take bits and pieces of it and say that this part is not constitutional or this part is going to be problematic. But now we have a federal judge out of Texas, a guy named Reed O'Connor, who has ruled that the Affordable Care Act has become unconstitutional without the individual mandate. So essentially his assertion, and this is just a layman's excuse of it, we all remember that back when the Obamacare debate was going on and we had it actually go through the Supreme Court came down and said the reason that it is constitutional is because the federal government has the right to tax people. And so because the individual mandate is a tax, which, by the way, that's not the way it was written. It was written as a fee, and it was billed as a fee. But all of a sudden, when it got to the Supreme Court, they basically said, well, they meant it was a tax. So again, I won't rehash that whole decision, but the Supreme Court essentially saying, well, you know what we meant. We know that the legislator really meant that it was a tax, so we're going to call it a tax even though the law says it was a fee. So they rewrote the bill 4 times to be able to save Obamacare. And right now, because that was basically the nail that the entire edict that they wrote hung on, in other words, the entire decision by the Supreme Court hinged on the individual mandate and it being a tax. The federal judge from Texas, Reed O'Connor, has now said, essentially, because that was the central part of the Obamacare law, that when the senators undid that, remember that's the only part of Obamacare that was actually repealed was the individual mandate. In other words, the part of the law that says, regardless of what else is going on in your life, you are a human being, a citizen of the United States, therefore you must have health care or face penalties. That was the part that got repealed. And so since that part, the only part of the several thousand-page law has been repealed, this judge is saying, well, that was central to Obamacare. That was central to the Supreme Court ruling it constitutional. Therefore, now that that part is gone, it is no longer constitutional. So, not being an attorney myself, I really don't understand how all of that works. For example, even though that was sort of the catalyst by which the Supreme Court ruled it constitutional, that does not mean it necessarily became unconstitutional once it was repealed. I'm not saying that it is constitutional from the beginning. I've said it was unconstitutional from the very beginning. But that was the primary part that I thought was unconstitutional, is the fact that the federal government can obligate you to purchase a product, not of your own free will, basically control your purchasing power as an individual citizen. And yet, now that that part is gone, he's saying that's the part that made it constitutional because that's what the Supreme Court originally said in their opinion and their ruling on it. That to me seems a little off, but I mean, if that's what he's saying, maybe somebody a little bit more well-versed in the law would be able to inform me about why that is. But this was what he said in his opinion. The remainder of the ACA is non-severable from the individual mandate, meaning that the act must be invalidated as a whole. Now, that does make sense if he's saying that we can't sever these two because it's such a central part of that law that you can't take that part out without the whole thing collapsing and becoming unconstitutional. So based on that logic, it actually does kind of make sense that that is the case. I don't necessarily know if that's the way that it would work, because originally on first glance, it seemed dubious to me that when you take the part that seemed the most unconstitutional out of the law, that all of a sudden the rest of the law becomes unconstitutional. Now, I believe Obamacare is unconstitutional. You all know that. I'm just saying that the reasoning behind it didn't seem to make sense to me, but that gives me a little bit more reason to sort of go along with this and sort of say that actually does make some sense, that it's such a central part of the law that once you take that part out, the rest of it collapses in on itself and becomes no longer constitutional, no longer functionable. So that's essentially what he's saying. And the potential problem that could lead to, I mean, for Obamacare, obviously, is that the whole law winds up going away because that central part of it was taken out. And many Democrats, including Obama himself, did make that case. If you remember back when we were having this debate, back during Obama's first term around 2009, 2010, before it passed, you may remember and remember well that one of the big things that was being debated back and forth is that they said, Republicans said, well, we might consider voting for it if you take out the individual mandate. And Democrats said, well, you can't take out the individual mandate. It's the central part of all of it. In fact, if you take out the individual mandate, you're getting rid of all the young, healthy people that are going to be funding it by requiring them to have health insurance. And what you're going to have is just a bunch of old people that are taking more out of the system than they put in, which, by the way, is what wound up happening anyway, because they made it to where a lot of the people would rather incur the fees instead of having health care in the first place. So that part of the law being taken out, that was, according to the Democrats' argument at the time, a central feature of the law without which the law does not work. And that case was being made by the Democrats. That case was being made by Barack Obama himself, going out and making the case for why Obamacare needed to pass through with that part of it intact. And so, ironically, some of the arguments Democrats made for Obamacare at the time may wind up coming back and biting them in the butt, because they made the case that you have to have that. You can't separate them. It is absolutely inalienable to have these two separate from each other. And now that part has been repealed by the Republican House and Senate, well, actually, that does kind of hurt their case that it can stand without it now. And so on that particular note, it's going to be harder because they were the ones making the case that you had to have it. It's going to make it much more difficult for Democrats to make the case now that, oh, it's not really a central part, and even though it's been repealed, the rest of Obamacare is still in place. I'm not saying that it's impossible to make that case. I'm just saying that since they were the ones making that argument, now that hill is a lot steeper. And Democrats, as you can imagine, are quite furious about this. Let's read a couple of quotes here. California Attorney General Xavier Becerra, he said, "Today's ruling is an assault on the 133 million Americans with pre-existing conditions, on the 20 million Americans who rely on the ACA's consumer protections for health care, and on America's faithful progress toward affordable care for all Americans." So obviously the Attorney General of California very upset about this, which no surprise there. I mean, California constantly elects uber liberal people. And I will note that the Attorney General, the chief law enforcement officer for the state of California, do you notice one thing about that statement? Do you notice that nowhere in there does he actually talk about the law's constitutionality? Do you notice that nowhere in there does he say that the judge is actually wrong in saying that the constitutionality is in question now? You see, he doesn't make that argument. The only argument that he can make, the only argument that he knows how to make is, well, now there's an awful lot of people that their health care is under assault, which, by the way, isn't true for a number of reasons. But rather than going into the weeds, and we will hit that a little bit later in the show, but rather than getting off in the weeds, let's look at his primary focus here. He's not saying anything about whether or not it's constitutional. He's not saying anything about whether or not it's legal, or whether or not the judge's opinion was correct or incorrect. He's saying, well, it's a bad thing because it assaults people's free health care. See, that's the only argument he can make. An appeal to emotion is the only thing the guy knows how to do, because he can't make the legal argument for it, so he has to fall back on making an appeal to your feelings, because that's really the only way that he knows how to argue. And he goes after he's saying, well, pre-existing conditions, and there will be 20 million Americans that have those and are not going to be able to get coverage. There were people with pre-existing conditions that had health care long before Obamacare was ever even considered. And again, we'll get into some of those details in just a second. So there was another one, this one by Stephen Dennis, who is, he's a reporter for Bloomberg. And he said, quote, "There are no senators who voted for the tax law thinking it would eliminate the ACA. It would never have passed with that understanding. Trust me, I've spoken to many, many, many senators about this, but," I don't know why but is in all caps, but it is apparently, "but if this ruling stands, the ACA is gone, toast." And the truth is, even though I guess that based on some of his political leanings, Stephen Dennis and I would agree on very few things politically, there's not a single word of that that's untrue. First of all, if this ruling does stand, and it may, if this ruling stands, the ACA is completely gone with. It is done away completely. There is no more Obamacare. It is done. That is true. But you know what else is true? Had the Republican senators known that this was going to happen, they would not have voted for it. They did not want to repeal Obamacare. That is 100% true. You had Mitch McConnell, old Cocaine Mitch, who came out. Cocaine Mitch comes out and he gave lip service to it. He says, we have to get rid of Obamacare. We have to dig it up, root, tree, all, everything. We're going to dig it up by its roots. We're going to take out every aspect of it. And then he gets Republican House, Republican Senate, and a Republican in the White House that he knows would sign a repeal of Obamacare, and goes, we're just going to try to repeal a few parts of it. And they did try for a full repeal, but it wound up getting very few votes. I don't even know if that one actually ever made it out of committee. I'd have to look back at that. But they tried several skinny repeals, and then they tried the last appeal, which finally did make it out, to finally repeal at least one small tiny portion of Obamacare, which now this federal judge is voting is the catalyst that led him to the conclusion that the entire thing is unconstitutional. But anyway, that being said, you had the Republicans in the Senate. You're right. They had no problem going to the mat defending Obamacare. They didn't want to repeal Obamacare. Mitch McConnell and most of the Republican senators voted to keep it. When given the opportunity to get rid of Obamacare altogether, they said, no, we're just going to change the name and change a few of these things here or there. And then even that one didn't pass. So they wound up just getting rid of the individual mandate. And so he's absolutely right on that. The Republican senators, they do not care about individual liberty. They do not care about getting rid of this monstrosity that is Obamacare. And because of that, they didn't vote to repeal it. He is absolutely right when he says that had Republican senators known about this, they would not have voted for it. So even though I probably politically disagree with him, Steve Dennis actually, I think 100% accurate on that one. He is absolutely right when it comes to that. But here's the thing. What he is saying is in and of itself not an argument against this ruling. Because just because senators wouldn't have voted for it had that taken place does not mean that the consequences of them passing that legislation are now done away with. Because if that was the litmus test, if we had to go back and reevaluate, hey, that legislation you passed a year ago, if you had known it was going to do this, would you have voted for it? And they said, well, no, if I had known that at the time, it wouldn't have voted for it. Say, oh, see, it didn't have it. Now it doesn't have the votes. That's not how this works. You can't go back and retroactively undo a bill because the senators or the House members or whoever happened to vote for it at the time didn't know that that was going to be what eventually happened when they signed or voted for that law. You know, if you go back to the president, same thing. If that were true, the president could sort of just retroactively saying, yeah, you know, I didn't actually intend for that to happen when I signed that bill into law, so I'm going to go ahead and just say no. No, that's not how it works. Legislation has consequences, and often, I would even say more often than not, legislation has unintended consequences. And you cannot merely just say with the wave of your hand, you know what happened back then where I voted for it? Yeah, I've changed my mind. It turns out that actually was a pretty bad idea. So I'm going to go with, no, I wouldn't have voted that way had that taken place. So I get what he's saying, and I think that Stephen Dennis is actually correct in his assessment. But that doesn't change the fact that if this thing is unconstitutional, then it really doesn't matter what the senators intended to do or not. What matters is the fact that they passed it and it had this unintended consequence. So I think on their part, it actually was unintended. But the point is, whether it was intended or not really doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. And of course, the person for whom the legislation is named, I know it's technically the Affordable Care Act, but Obama himself commented on this decision on Obamacare. So let's go ahead and go to him. This is Barack Obama on Facebook. There are two things you need to know today about healthcare. First, today's the last day for open enrollment. That means it's the deadline to make sure the people you love have health insurance in 2019. So head over to healthcare.gov and get covered. Second, you may have heard about the federal court decision on the Republican lawsuit trying to strike down the Affordable Care Act in its entirety. That can be a scary thing to hear, particularly if you or someone you care about has a pre-existing condition. And that's why it's so important for you to know that last night's ruling changes nothing for now. Now, I could go in a little bit more in depth to it, but actually on its surface, for right now, Barack Obama is actually correct in that because it's been appealed, which was no surprise. They knew it was going to be appealed. And so because of that, for the moment, it's going to stay in place. But I want to point out something I think that's even more significant. Do you notice that right before Obama addresses this, right before he talks about this possibly being struck down, that he encourages people to sign up? You know, if Barack Obama were so incredibly worried about people not having health insurance, then he would be saying, hey, wait a second, hold on. We'll see where this goes. And maybe you should go to the private market. Maybe you should go somewhere else for your health insurance because we don't know how this thing's going to shake out. And so for your protection, so you're not left without health insurance, if this thing goes belly up, maybe you should hold off on that. No. He says the exact opposite. And why does he do so? The reason he is trying to get an increase in people enrolling is because A, he knows that enrollment has dropped off. And B, he knows that the more people that are enrolled, the more people that are in, that are now have to go off of the markets or go somewhere else for their health insurance. If Obamacare goes away, the more painful it will be. And the more painful it will be, the less likely Republicans, be they judges or be they legislators, are going to be willing to pull that rug out from under people. So in a political sense, Barack Obama is basically using these people as human shields. He's basically saying, I don't care if it messes up your life. I don't care if it, messes with your health insurance. As long as my legacy is protected, really not too concerned with what happens to you. In a roundabout way, that's exactly what he's saying, because he's saying, I would rather you go ahead and sign up for this health insurance that for all we know could be gone within the next few months. But you know what? As long as it protects my legacy, as long as it makes it harder for Republicans to undo my signature legislation, that's fine. I don't really care. They talk about Republicans being uncompassionate and unsympathetic and not caring about people. This is Barack Obama saying to the masses, you need to go ahead and sign up for Obamacare to protect my legacy. And if you get hurt in the process, whatever. That is just so unconscionable to me. And it amazes me that the media is not calling him out on that. I mean, what would be wrong with him saying, why don't we hold on and see where this thing is going, and then maybe you consider signing up for Obamacare? No. He's doing the exact opposite. He's feeding people into a system, or trying to at least, trying to encourage people to go into a system that may be gone within a few months, and saying that he's doing so because he wants to protect his signature legislation. I mean, it just absolutely blows my mind. But I guess as long as his legacy is protected, that's what's really important here. I mean, who cares what happens to everyday Americans as long as his, I guess his legislation is protected in the history books. So, not being the only person that this happened to, the left has really just gone absolutely nuts with this whole thing. CNN trying to make a case for why Obamacare should stick around. They put this article together called "What's at Stake with Obamacare," and essentially all the things that we would lose, like that would be a big loss, that we would lose if Obamacare were undone. And so there's several things, and I'm going to go through most of them. I don't think I'll have time to touch on all of them. One of the things they mentioned was Medicaid expansion. So Medicaid has been expanded quite a bit under Obamacare, and this to me is a big reason why we should get rid of Obamacare. In fact, I looked through this article, and basically what CNN did was make a comprehensive list of all the reasons we should get rid of Obamacare. So let's go ahead and look at this one first of all. Medicaid expansion. Let's look at Medicaid expenditures. And using Statista as my source here. So if you'll look at this graph, and you'll see that it goes from 2008 to 2018, so a 10-year span, and I tried to get an even number, 5 years and 5 years, the expansion between each one. So if you're looking at that, you'll see that in 2018, our Medicare expenditures, and this is projected because, of course, 2018 isn't quite over yet, so this is sort of a guesstimate here, but it's pretty close to accurate. $629.3 billion. That's a long way from 2018, the year before Barack Obama took office, and keep in mind that Obamacare was fully implemented in 2014. So that's really the jumping off point that we're going to be looking at. So back in 2008, it was $351.9 billion. So what's important to remember about this, because we need to look at the numbers in an objective manner as possible. If you're looking at your total increase when it came to Medicaid spending, from 2008 to 2013, remember the year before Obamacare really took place and was fully implemented, you went from your total increase is about $104.1 billion. Now, you compare that to the increase that occurs between 2013 and 2018, well, then you're looking at $173 billion. Guys, that is a 60% increase on the regular increase. So in other words, it's always been increasing. You can see that by the graph, but you'll notice in 2014, those bars start to stretch out further with each year. And that's because there was a 60% increase on the increase. And I know that's a little confusing, but it increases by 60% more is the easiest way to say it. 60% more than it was before Obamacare was implemented. And by the way, if you're saying, well, inflation and all that, so you really can't judge those numbers based on the year. Well, here's the problem with that. If you actually look at the average annual increase, in other words, you're looking at how much it increases by year to year, the average increase from 2008 to 2013 was $20 billion. The average increase from 2013 to 2018, $34.7 billion. That's a substantial amount. In fact, that plays right along. It's about a 59% increase per year on average. So if you're looking at these two, and you're looking at before Obamacare and you're looking at after Obamacare, the increase in Medicaid spending skyrocketed, going up by 60%. That's how much more it increased each individual year. I mean, we are spending so much money on Medicaid, which was already one of our biggest, most expensive entitlement programs. And Medicaid and Medicare combined, Medicare spending went up. I mean, the whole thing was a big problem. And you also have the fishhook for the states. So what happened with the fishhook is when they expanded Medicaid, they encouraged the states to expand Medicaid as well. And basically the deal that they made with them was, we're going to pay for all of it up front, and then we're going to start backing you off after 3 years. So in other words, they signed the government officials up for a contract, and a lot of states and a lot of state officials saw that big chunk of money and said, ooh, I can tell my constituents that I got all that money to come to the state. And so what they do is they run for it with open arms, and they grab onto it without realizing there's a fishhook in that bait. And eventually what happens is the state gets stuck with a substantial bill that you've got to pay for. Now, federal dollars still pay for a lot of it, but now all of a sudden, by law, your state is on the hook and obligated to pay part of the Medicaid expansion. And so this thing not only radically increased our spending from the federal level, but it also increased our spending at the state level too. So just hordes and hordes of money going into this. Also, another thing that the CNN article mentioned was employer-sponsored health insurance. So this caused a lot of problems because you had a new class of people essentially made. The 49ers, and not the football team, the 49ers, and also the 29ers. Now, the 49ers were the businesses that only hired 49 people, because the second they hired that 50th person, they would then be required by law to provide health care for their employees. So there were a lot of businesses that just didn't expand. They had the capital to expand, but if they did, they would have to incur the cost of health care for each of their employees. And so this really hurt small businesses. Didn't hurt the big corporations because they were way over 50 by that point anyway. Not that Obamacare didn't help big corporations, but this specific rule didn't really affect them. But what it really did was it put a cap on the amount of employees you could get, or else it raised that ceiling for capital that you had to get if you wanted to expand your business further. And so what happened is there were an awful lot of small businesses that just didn't expand past 49 employees because of how expensive it would be to do so. And in the same sense, you also had the 29ers. These were people that because they could only work 30 hours a week or less than 30 hours a week, then they were not able to get more hours, because doing so would mean that their business would have to pay for their health insurance. And so you had a lot of people that were only allowed to work 29 hours a week, even though they would have really been able to use that extra money. And I can say this from personal experience, not just from looking at the statistics, because this happened to me at 3 different jobs. 3 different jobs. I didn't have health insurance, and now I had less money because of how expensive it would be for my company to provide health insurance for me. And so it was just absolutely ridiculous that this bill, this law being put into place, actually kept money out of my pocket. This affected me in a very personal way, as you can recall. But anyway, this was a real issue for small businesses and part-timers. In other words, it hurt the poor most. It hurt the people that were not affluent. It wound up hurting them more than it hurt anybody else. It also mentioned kids staying on their parents' insurance until they're 26, which really is beyond ridiculous. I mean, you're 26 years old. You got to deal with your own stuff by that point. Then there's also the quote-unquote free contraceptives, mammograms, colonoscopies, and screenings. These things were now by law required for you to pay for with your insurance. They say it was free of charge, and you couldn't charge people for those things. But here's the thing. If something is government mandated to be free, then that means that the cost has to be covered somewhere. Because government can never make things less expensive. All they can do is shift the cost around. Because it costs money to see a doctor to have a colonoscopy or a mammogram. It costs money to purchase contraceptives. Those things can't just magically be made to cost nothing. And so what wound up happening is it wasn't free. That cost was just spread to everybody else. So in other words, if I, as a healthy 27, 28-year-old man, because of course I got cancer when I was 28, so I'm talking about before that, I, as a perfectly healthy 27-year-old man who is never going to need a mammogram, is never going to need birth control pills, if I all of a sudden now have to pay for that for other people. Because if I'm in the insurance pool, then I have to pay for some old guy's colonoscopy and somebody else's mammograms and contraceptives, because the insurance company is no longer allowed to charge extra for people that are going to need those things, nor is the hospital going to just do that stuff for free. So that money's got to come from somewhere. And so all that did was spread that particular cost to other people. And since younger people specifically happen to bear more of that cost and happen to, on average, have less money than our older counterparts, then what happened is, again, it wound up screwing the poor people more than it did the people that were affluent and could probably afford it. And so yet again, we see an example of Obamacare hurting poor people more than it actually hurt those that were wealthy and could bear the cost. And when you spread that money out, when you spread that cost out over everybody, you're going to wind up with an awful lot of people paying for it that aren't actually using that service. And so I, as a young, non-sexually active 27-year-old, was paying to subsidize the sexual escapades of other people and to subsidize the mammograms of other people. Now look, on a personal level, if I know that somebody's in need, if I had a sister in Christ come to me today and say, look, I need some money, I got to get this mammogram, I have a family history of breast cancer and I'm at high risk and I really need some help, I would do the best that I could to find that money, whether it came from me or came from other people. I mean, that's the kind of thing that I have done before. But to tell me as a government that I have to pay for somebody who I don't even know, and I have to purchase that through the insurance policy that I got, and that cost has to be put on to me, that's beyond stupid. Furthermore, one of the other things that they mentioned, and I will say this, to their credit, CNN did mention this. They did mention that all the things that I just listed under the employer-sponsored insurance, they did say, well, that did cause the premiums to skyrocket. So to CNN's credit, even though they tend to get things wrong on this sometimes, CNN did actually admit in their article, well, that was a problem because it did cause health insurance costs and healthcare costs to go up. So, props to CNN for at least mentioning that, even though really this entire article was designed in such a way to make people worried about losing their healthcare coverage or whatever else it may be. I mean, you can tell that by the headline. They also mentioned the individual market, and they said these protections are on people with pre-existing conditions, including women, and limited what they could charge to seniors. So in other words, a young healthy person that is very low risk is now required to pay, they could charge no more than 3 times what they were charging to a young healthy person than they were to a senior. Well, if the senior is using more services and he's at a much higher risk of needing those services, then by default, the market would demand that a senior pay more. Or, because here's what they're going to do. Again, you can't make things cost less. So what you have to do is you have to raise everybody's prices now that there are people that are taking more out of the system than they're putting into it. Which means what? The older people are now going to be subsidized by the younger people that are at lower risk and should be paying less for their health insurance. So again, it wound up screwing the people that were poorest, the people that were most vulnerable. It is just amazing that Obamacare wound up hitting the poorest among us hardest every single time. I mean, the people that were paying nothing and not working, those people got a pretty sweet deal out of it because they just got free health care. But if you're talking about working class people, people that were younger, people that were trying to make it, people that were trying to move up when it came to wealth, those were the people that it actually hurt. Didn't hurt the people that didn't have a job. Didn't hurt the people that were just drawing out of the government. The only people that it really hurt were the people that were trying to move up in the world, people trying to make more money for themselves. People that were actually busting their butts every day. Those are the people that it actually wound up targeting, specifically younger people. And the idea that a large plurality, probably even a majority of my generation, somehow think that Obamacare was a good idea, despite all of this, absolutely blows my mind. And when it comes to the pre-existing condition thing, I've explained this a million times, so I'm just going to give you the short version of it. A pre-existing condition is essential for an insurance company, or else they are not an insurance company. If you can say to your insurance company, yeah, I'm going to wait until after something happens to buy a policy, then that's just that company giving you free money. If I could say to the person that holds my home insurance, for example, yeah, my home's fine, I'm not going to buy any home insurance. And then all of a sudden my home gets swept away by a tornado or a fire or a flood or whatever. And then I come to them and say, yeah, I want to take out a policy. I got a lot of damage on my house I need to take care of. Well, you can see how that's not a sustainable business model. Because if I'm paying them a premium for, I don't know, $200 a month, and then they just spent $10,000 to repair my house, you can see how they wouldn't be able to stay in business long doing that. Because as soon as my repairs are done, I just cancel my policy. I got $10,000 worth of repair for a few $100s, and I don't pick up that health insurance until I need something again. Well, then you're just robbing the insurance company. And that's part of the reason that we saw so many insurance companies go belly up, because all you have to do is wait until you have a reason to have health insurance where you believe that you're going to come out on top. Because all insurance is risk management. That's a bunch of people going into a pool and paying for things, hoping that they don't get sick, but knowing that if they do, they'll be taken care of and subsidized by the other people that are not sick. But if you just allow people to not buy the policy and take advantage of that policy until after they actually need it, then that destroys the whole system. That destroys the whole reason of having insurance. Then the insurance company doesn't become an insurance company. They become basically a healthcare providing company. And you can see why that doesn't work, because unless the insurance company comes out on top, unless they bring in more than they put out, they're going to go under. And that's exactly the problem that you ran into with Obamacare over and over again. So here's the big question. What happens now? What does this mean for us? Here's my prediction. And I hate to say it, but this is my honest opinion about what's going to happen. This thing is going to get appealed and then get appealed to a higher court until it winds up at the Supreme Court. This decision most likely is going to wind up in the hands of the Supreme Court. And if I had to guess, what is going to happen is that the Supreme Court is going to hear it and they're going to reverse the decision. Here's why I say that. Remember, it was not Justice Kennedy, but Justice Roberts that was so bound and determined to save Obamacare that he was willing to actually rewrite the law in 4 different places to make sure that Obamacare was saved. John Roberts is a spineless nebbish who is convinced that he has to be as uncontroversial as possible to be a good Supreme Court Chief Justice. And that's who Roberts is. He tries in everything that he does to make decisions as narrowly as possible or to defend something on the narrowest of terms. He wants to be as uncontroversial as humanly possible. Why that is, I have no idea. Because as somebody who took an oath to uphold the Constitution, your first priority should be, is it constitutional or not? That should be your only job. But for whatever reason, Roberts is very concerned with how his court is seen in public. And because of that, he is terrified that his court will be the one that overturned Obamacare. And here's the thing. I don't know that Kavanaugh would overturn it either. Now, to be honest, Kavanaugh does seem a little bit better on this when it comes to things like free market and government intervention than he is on a lot of other issues. He's more conservative on that than he is others. And so if I had to take a stab in the dark right now, I would guess that Kavanaugh would rule it unconstitutional as well, but I'm not 100% sure. But frankly, it doesn't matter, because even if Kavanaugh sides with the conservative justices and rules this thing unconstitutional, you can bet your bottom dollar Justice Roberts is going to side with the liberal wing. I mean, he's already done it once. He's already just gone leaps and bounds beyond what is appropriate for a justice, writing legislation himself, and then going to the nth degree and bending over backwards to try to make sure he saved Obamacare. And you can bet, if given the option, he's going to do it again. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I really hope that I am, but you can put money down on that this is what I'm saying, and you know, I'll be pleased to be wrong if it turns out that I'm wrong. But if I had to guess right now, what's going to happen is that Roberts is going to side with the liberal justices again on Obamacare and wind up saving the law. Lots of exciting things going on right now, but I think probably the biggest one that we could go to is the border debate has been raging on for some time now. It really hit a new, fever pitch, I guess is the right word to say, with this story that came out by the Washington Post. So the Washington Post the other day posted this story, and here's the headline. 7-year-old migrant girl taken into Border Patrol custody dies of dehydration, exhaustion. All right, so based on that headline, pretty cut and dry. I mean, it's pretty clear. Sorry about that. It's pretty clear what they're trying to do. It's pretty clear that they're trying to give the impression to the reader that this poor little girl, and her death is incredibly tragic. I understand that. I'm with them on that. That because she was taken into custody by the Border Patrol, that's the way the headline reads, that she was dehydrated and wound up dying. That's the impression that this headline is giving. And this is why it's so important to understand fake news. Because I think it's important to define our terms here. Some people buy fake news, and this is kind of the definition that I adopt. We're talking about news that is intentionally deceptive. In other words, if people are putting out a news story that they know that they are giving false information on. This is an example of sort of a softer definition of fake news. Because if you read through the article, it actually gives you a lot of the details, but only if you read the article. And the thing is, if you are pushing a political agenda, you know that today, really all you've got to do is write a headline. Because do you know what the average time that a American spends reading a news story is? They've done studies on this. The average time is about 8 seconds. In other words, most people are reading the headline and moving on. And that means for every person like me that actually reads the whole article, you've got way more Americans, because I bring the average up by a lot. And I know that a lot of you guys that are listening to me that actually read these stories do too. But if you're reading most of a story, that means you've got a lot more people that are just reading a headline. Because if that's the average time, it doesn't take a mathematician to understand there's an awful lot of people spending even less time than 8 seconds on these stories. And so this is the game that the Washington Post plays. They know really all they've got to do is write a chilling headline that gets everybody whipped up in a frenzy, and they've already won. Even if they tell the truth, even if what comes under the headline completely undermines the message that the headline seems to give, they know all they've got to do is get that salacious headline out there, and it causes a buzz. And that's exactly what is happening right now. Because they bury the lead, they bury the actual details of the story. As an example, let's go ahead and read part of this. A 7-year-old girl from Guatemala died of dehydration and shock after she was taken into Border Patrol custody last week for crossing Mexico into the United States illegally with her father and a large group of migrants along a remote span of New Mexico desert, U.S. Customs and Border Protection said Thursday. The child's death is likely to intensify scrutiny of detention conditions at Border Patrol stations and CBP facilities that are increasingly overwhelmed by large numbers of families seeking asylum in the United States. According to CBP records, the girl and her father were taken into custody about 10 p.m. December 6th, south of Lordsburg, New Mexico, as a part of a group of 163 people who approached U.S. agents to turn themselves in. More than 8 hours later, the child began having seizures at 6:25 a.m., CBP records show. Emergency responders, who arrived soon after, measured the body temperature at 105.7 degrees, so ridiculously high. And according to a statement from CBP, she, quote, reportedly had not eaten or consumed water for several days. So that is according to the CBP. And you just read that part of the article, and it doesn't take long to figure out that this article was written specifically to try to make the border agents look bad. It was written specifically to give this indication that, well, she's been in their custody for a while now, and she was dehydrated, she didn't have any food, and she had this ridiculously high temperature, and while she was in Border Patrol custody, then she winds up dying. But see, if you read just a little bit further into the article, you'll see that the facts that they give here in a second really kind of completely undermines that narrative. So let's continue on in this story. After a helicopter flight to Providence Children's Hospital in El Paso, the child went into cardiac arrest and was revived according to the agency. However, the child did not recover and died in the hospital less than 24 hours after being transported, CBP said. The agency did not release the name of the girl or the father, but the father remains in El Paso awaiting a meeting with the Guatemalan consular officials, according to CBP. The agency is investigating the incident to ensure appropriate policies were followed, it said. Food and water are typically provided to migrants in Border Patrol custody, and wasn't immediately clear Thursday if the girl received provisions and a medical exam before the onset of the seizures. Oh! Oh, so you actually don't know whether or not Border Patrol gave her food or water or not. All you know is that the initial report is that when they took custody of her, according to them, that she had not had food or water at that point. And not only that, when this girl starts having seizures, they not only provided care to her, they got a medical evac in a helicopter for her to take her to the nearest children's hospital. So if you read a little bit further in the story, you see that the details are actually the exact opposite of what the headline would lead you to believe. Border Patrol agents did everything within their power to try to make sure this girl was safe. And even the Washington Post has to admit, well, we don't know if they actually gave her any provisions or not. All we know is that she was having the seizure and then she was medical lifted to a hospital and died 24 hours later. So here's the real question in all of this. Why was the girl going across miles of open desert in the blazing sun without food or water? Because if you ask me, that was the father's doing, not the Border Patrol officials. And if an American father took his child out in the middle of the desert without food or water and exposed her to that kind of condition, and she died, that father would be brought to court for child neglect, if not murder. And that's exactly what should have happened. And if that's what happened with this father, we're still trying to sort through the details, but if that's what happened with the father, and it appears at least from this article that that was what was going on, then you should be mad at the father, not the Border Patrol agents. He had her whole life and decided it was a good idea to go on a trek through the desert to get here. The Border Patrol agents did everything they were supposed to, according to this. All right, so we have a caller on line one. Let's go to the phones. Good morning. What's on your mind?
Hey, good morning. Yeah, I just wanted to address this, if I may.
Go ahead.
First of all, I think that you've got a good versus evil here. As far as the progressives are concerned, it's going to be absolutely automatic every time. The border control people, the government people, are, because of who's in the White House and who's in charge of the Senate, they're always going to be evil. No matter what happens, no matter what transpires, it's going to be their fault. And that's the way that it's going to be depicted in the media or whatever, and verbally or whatever else it is. Because I've listened to some of the rhetoric about this, and they don't say anything about the description that you just gave at all. And so it's always going to be that way. So people's impression will be, well, those agents just let that little girl die, and they didn't care whether she lived or not, and it's because they're racist. I mean, that's kind of how they're depicting it.
Right, and that's how they're going to depict it. And what you said about who's in the White House being a big part of that, you're absolutely right on that, too. You'll remember that just earlier this year, the child separation thing became a huge issue. But they neglected to tell you that when Obama was running that department, there were almost 3 times as many child separations as there were under Barack Obama, or the children that got lost. Sorry, the children that wound up, they didn't know where they were. Almost 3 times that number happened under Barack Obama.
At that point, there were no cameras, no pictures, no stories given about any of that at all because of who's in the White House. Because he couldn't possibly be mishandling anything in particular that were ever a race issue at all.
Well, exactly.
Because he is incapable of that.
No, you're exactly right. And that's, that's part of the problem that we're running into.
Well, I know that it's going to continue to be that way. You'll have to draw a distinction between the two throughout any of these stories, and the fault will always be the same way. And it will never be the fault of any of the people that are going to break the law by heading north, and not like they can't stop off in Mexico. And I guess the only reason they can't is because Mexico won't take them. They make them move. But this is an orchestrated event that's designed politically to reach an end goal and to depict the conservative side as people that have no concern, no compassion, no care. And the only thing I've always said about this is, well, then why in the world aren't the progressives down there helping take care of these people?
Well, and I'll say this.
New York, or they'll sit in Washington and make decisions or make judgments about how all of this is going, but they'll never dirty their hands with it.
Well, now, I don't think that the girl actually passing away was an orchestrated event, but I think there's no question that the way it was covered Absolutely
but any mishap, anything that happens,
right.
and that's tragedy for that to happen for that little girl.
Of course it is.
Nobody's not saying that, but trying to blame the person in the White House for a little girl dying because of all those things that you just mentioned is ridiculous.
Right, and that's the thing. Even if it were a case of neglect by the Border Patrol, which nothing in this article leads me to believe that it is, even if that actually were the case, it still wouldn't be Donald Trump's fault. Now, if there is a systematic problem, in other words, this is something that happens very commonly, that the Border Patrol agents are ill-prepared or don't have the resources to help these people, or they're trained not to help these people, okay, that you can blame on the White House.
Yeah.
But if it were just a one-off incident where this happened, then even then you still couldn't blame the White House because they can't control every individual that's going to be taking place there. And as long as they're disciplining their employees and training them correctly, they can't be held accountable for that.
No, and, they're not God to be able to make somebody overcome either. And it's a sad thing, but it would be the same thing as if when the Obama administration was in, it blamed him for all the crime in the country. Well, he was in charge, so he doesn't care about crime. He doesn't care about people. You know what I mean? Well, and it's the same kind of idea. And that's ludicrous, just as this other is.
It is, and that's the thing. We tend to give too much credit and too much blame to presidents we like or don't like, depending on the situation.
Right.
And that's true. Thank you so much for your call. I appreciate it. But you're absolutely right on that. And here's the problem that you're running into. They're in such a rush to be wrong. They're in such a rush to go ahead and get whatever it is narrative that they want out there at the time, that they just kind of charge ahead and go with it and don't ever consider what kind of implication it has. Keep in mind that Border Patrol agents are not perfect. They are human beings, but they are also law enforcement officials. And to suggest that there is a law enforcement agency out there that is actively trying to, or at the very least apathetic, towards young girls being killed, I mean, that is beyond reprehensible, and you better have your facts straight if you're going to make an allegation like that. And even though the Washington Post kind of does give you the detail a little bit later in the article, you can tell that the entire article and the structure of it was designed in such a way so that they could say, well, technically we didn't lie, and technically we did give you the details, but it's structured in such a way to place as much blame on Border Patrol as possible, even though if you're looking at the details, there's really no reason to believe that that was the case in the first place. So now the father, I'm so bad with these names, Neri Cal Cuz, is disputing the narrative told by the Washington Post. So he says that she was not starving or thirsty and only became ill during the transport. And so that's what the dad is saying right now in an interview that happened over the weekend, that, well, she wasn't hungry, she wasn't thirsty, there had been food and water provided for her, and she didn't really get ill or show any signs of getting ill until we were on that bus. And then all of a sudden she started to run a fever and started vomiting and all this other stuff. And then they medical evac'd her. And he said, according to them, this is according to the Guatemalan consul, Tecandi Panagua, he told CNN in an interview that her father had no complaints about the way the Border Patrol treated him or his child. Now, there's a couple different reasons for this, because I don't know if he was actually trekking across the desert with no food or water with his daughter or not. That was what the initial report from Border Control said. So it is entirely possible that what happened is he's lying about this, and he's trying to do so because he's trying to keep his own butt from getting thrown in prison for child neglect. That is a possibility. I don't know if that's true or not, and I think the investigation will bear that out. But here's the thing. Whether or not that's true, neither one of these two possibilities paint the Border Patrol in bad light. Because if he was actually guilty of child neglect, well, then it's on him that his daughter died. It's on him that she was put in this condition when she was transported. And if not, even then the father is saying, well, I still have no complaints about the way the Border Patrol treated us. They did everything they could to save his daughter's life. That's according to him, not me. And so I don't see a scenario based on the facts that we already have that the Border Patrol could have done anything different than they did. They tried everything they could to save this girl's life, spared no expense. And here's what I want to ask you. And I think this is a testament to this country, because I'm tired of progressives trying to paint us as unsympathetic, uncaring monsters for wanting to enforce Border Patrol and wanting to enforce border security. Do you know of another country, anywhere on this earth, Europe, Africa, Asia, wherever, do you know of another country anywhere on this earth that would have spent that kind of money and resources to save an illegal immigrant child? Maybe there is, but I'm not aware of it. Maybe I'm wrong, but to my knowledge, there is not another country on earth other than America that would have done that. That would have lifted that child and did the best that they could to try to save her, revived her once, but unfortunately couldn't save her in the long run. So, first of all, I don't like this assertion that America is some kind of racist, evil country, which is what they always try to talk about anytime you even mention increasing border security. I just don't believe that. And this story is a testament to how America is good and not racist and does care about these kids. And our Border Patrol is included in that. And it just really burns me up that in this story that ought to be a testament to how great our Border Patrol is and how hard they do work to keep people safe. The Border Patrol rescues people, for example, that are drowning in the Rio Grande all the time. People that put themselves in bad situations because they're trying to cross the border, and then the Border Patrol actually winds up saving their life and then processes them or whatever because they happen to be there when they get caught in these bad situations. These are the stories you don't hear about Border Patrol. But I, for one, would like to thank our Border Patrol for doing such a great job and for caring about people and doing the best that they could to save this little girl's life. There's no telling how many children's lives they have saved by catching them and catching their parents and being able to provide them food or medicine or whatever else it is that they need. And this is a routine thing because they wouldn't have been able to get this medical evac if they didn't have a system in place to do so already. So, this guy also apparently signed a form that said he had no need of immediate medical attention, but it is important to note, because I want to be fair about this, he doesn't speak any English, and the form was in English, so he may not have even known what he was signing. He probably didn't know that that's what the form said unless there was a translator that explained it to him. But nonetheless, some people are pointing to that. I wouldn't necessarily point to that just because that's dubious considering he doesn't speak any English. So he probably... But I will say, if that's the case, how does Border Patrol know that? All they know is he just signed a form that said he had no need of medical attention. And his daughter didn't have any need of medical attention. And if that's the case, well, then it's not the Border Patrol's fault. According to the father, they were just following protocol and basing that based on his word. Now, according to him, she didn't take ill until the transport anyway, and we really don't know. But this is the thing that drives me nuts. The left has this constant crusade to try to paint us as a racist, xenophobic country, and specifically conservatives, specifically people that favor border control and border protection. You'll remember that we saw all these pictures of the buses with car seats, and they were talking about how evil that was, that they were shipping babies off to different places. Yeah, it turns out they were actually taking them on field trips to the zoo and to parks because of how young these kids were. They had to have car seats. Oh, and by the way, that bus was purchased in 2014 under the Obama administration. And then we also saw all those pictures of kids in cages, which again happened to be from 2015, also under the Obama administration, because that was the only place they had to put them where they couldn't get loose. And I'm not necessarily justifying it. I'm just saying that this outrage did not exist back when it was Barack Obama. You remember the lies that we were told about the little girl in that pink jacket, the little girl that was sitting there crying that became a viral picture. Yeah, only the problem is that girl was never separated from her mother. Her mother just set her down for a second to fill out some paperwork, and then she was returned to her mother immediately. Oh, and by the way, she was crying because she had been up all night and been trekking across the desert for the past week. She wasn't crying because of that. She wasn't crying because she was separated from her mother, because her mother was standing right there. But that's not what the media said. That's not the narrative the media wanted to run with. A couple weeks ago with the migrant caravan, you had the woman who had those 2 twin girls that were 5 years old and still wearing diapers. There was the picture of her and her 2 twin daughters fleeing the tear gas with her kids in diapers. Only, why was a 5-year-old wearing diapers in the first place? And you had people in the back that didn't seem deterred by the tear gas at all, weren't even moving, just standing there watching. And you had people with cameras in the background. The whole thing was staged. There was an interview with her, I think actually with Washington Post, about a day later, and magically her kids had pants in that interview. So the whole thing was staged from the very beginning. And as long as it fits the narrative, the media is perfectly fine with running with whatever they have. So Bob O'Rourke, I know some people call him Beto, but I call him by his birth name, Bob. Bob O'Rourke claims that they were killing immigrants. The walls were killing immigrants. And he was saying the reason for this is that because the walls are specifically situated in places that the migrants are coming across, then what it's doing is it's making them take harder roads, which are more dangerous and more likely to result in these deaths. This was sort of a response to this story coming out in the Washington Post. This is kind of like those cases where you have people that are complaining about when burglars break into their house and they slip on a piece of soap or something like that, and they wind up suing the homeowner. That's kind of what this is like. You know, the easiest way to keep yourself and your family out of danger and to make sure that you don't die of exposure or get heat stroke or anything like that when crossing the border into America illegal is to not cross the border into America illegally. That is the easiest solution to that problem. Beto O'Rourke is making excuses for people breaking the law. And furthermore, and I think that this is even a bigger testament to this, what would be his solution then? To break down the walls that we have and just let them pass through? I mean, really, that is what he wants. But he won't say that, but there is no other logical conclusion you can get to. If he's saying that the walls are killing immigrants, then the only possible solution to that would be, well, let's just let them all in. Just break down the walls, let them cross anytime they want to. That's never going to work. The reason that they want that is because they know they are breeding voters. And under Trump, because he's been much stricter when it comes to illegal immigration, actually attempted crossings are down. If you look at the statistics, there are less people attempting to cross the border, which is part of the reason that he's detaining less people and shipping less people out. As part of the reason the Obama administration had so many more child separations, children that were lost, and had to deport more people because they had more people coming in. Because there was sort of this mentality by the Obama administration that, hey, everybody's welcome, come over when you want. Trump has the opposite idea, and because of that, these attempts are actually down, which goes to show you what? A secure border will help keep the deaths of these people or the risk to these people at a minimum. Because it's very hard to get sick crossing the border if you don't cross the border. You may get sick from something else, but it ain't going to be that. And so a robust, secure border is actually the best solution to help these people and help them with their problems. Because if you really want to know what's killing these people, what's drawing them in and what's enticing them to try to come across the border in the first place, welfare state, sanctuary cities. That's it. You've got business leaders that are not being held accountable for their actions when they hire illegals. And because of that, there is a promise of jobs here. And there's also a very generous welfare state, which people are able to take advantage of, pay for their food, pay for their kids' education. You've got police and fire services. You've got not just food stamps, but you've also got other welfare programs for other amenities. And so you've got all these things that they're able to take advantage of. Housing, whatever else. In some cases, medical care. Hillary Clinton, part of her platform when she was running in this past presidential election was that people should be on Obamacare regardless of their legal status. Very, very generous welfare state that these people are coming over here to take advantage of, that are enticing them to come over. And then, of course, you've got sanctuary cities that are going to protect them from being deported or the federal authorities as a whole. And so those things that are drawing them in, that's what's killing them. if you took those things away, if you got rid of them and there was nothing here to draw them in, you wouldn't have attempted border crossings in the first place. And because of that, you wouldn't have the deaths because of these attempted border crossings. So that being said, that really is going to be the best way to prevent it. So real quick before we go on to the Daily Dose of Stupid, because I know we're running a little behind, Nancy Pelosi responded to all of this when it came to border security about the budget. So, of course, you know that's the big contention between Republicans and Democrats right now. Democrats are saying that we should go ahead and push this through, and we should go ahead and pass the same budget we did last year. Donald Trump saying, I want more border security in the budget or else I'm not going to sign it. And so because of this, because they can't agree on this, the government is presumably going to shut down. And so this is Nancy Pelosi commenting on the potential government shutdown.
Let's hope that there won't be a shutdown of government. That's a very bad thing to do. Maybe the president doesn't grasp that, but that is very harmful to our country at significant cost. Another day, when we have more time, we'll go into when the Republicans shut it down before. On the 17th day, they finally opened. It cost of billions of dollars to our economy. And they still voted against opening up government. You know, we had a large number of Republicans voted against opening up the government.
What makes you think he changes his calibration, even if you're able to pass a bill under your watch on the 3rd of January? His position ostensibly wouldn't have changed. Why would he sign that bill to open government up in January?
But does he want to have government closed forever? I mean, what's this about? I know he doesn't believe in government. I know he doesn't know that much about what is at risk to shut it down.
All right, so what's really important about that clip is that when he asked the question, well, Trump hasn't changed his position, so if that bill winds up on his desk, and I'm paraphrasing here, why would he be any different than he was before? And Nancy Pelosi says, well, does he want the government shut down forever? Which implies that Nancy Pelosi is suggesting that they're not going to have border security, even if it means they have to shut down the government forever. Nancy Pelosi, of all people, Miss Big Government herself, is suggesting that they could shut down the government forever over this issue. And in response, the Libertarian Party has issued an official statement, an official response to this. Take a look. That's kind of my response too. I mean, this is really why I think it's so stupid that Republicans are afraid of a government shutdown. Because you remember when the shutdown happened that was kind of led by Ted Cruz, Republicans were horrified that the media was covering it as the Republican shutdown. And what happened in the very next election? Republicans made huge gains. Huge gains. And then we have another government shutdown, which was largely the Democrats' fault, even though, like I've always said, it takes two parties to shut down the government. That's just how this works. Even though it was largely the Democrats' fault, and they were kind of the ones that instigated it, because you remember Chuck Schumer had his list of demands when it came to the DACA recipients. And so they were the ones leading the charge on that. And you know what happened in the next election? Kind of a milquetoast. Democrats won some, Republicans won some seats. That was it. And so my point in all of this is, shutdowns do not hurt Republicans. They hurt Democrats. Or at the very least, they don't help Democrats. And so this idea that Republicans are always horrified of a government shutdown makes no sense to me. Aren't we supposed to be the party of conservatives? Aren't we supposed to be the party that thinks you don't have to have government in every facet of your life? Remember that there was a time where the House and the Senate only met for about a month out of a year. That was all they felt that was necessary. They met in December, and that was pretty much it. They didn't have to meet at any other time during the year. They got their legislation through, and then they all went back home, which I think was a better system and probably the way that it should be right now. Because I don't understand this horror that they get of the idea of a government shutting down, and this is an issue that is absolutely worth going to the mat on. If we shut down the government, and I don't know that it will happen or not, but if we shut down the government, we will not have to wait long for the Democrats to cave. Not long at all. Because they're the ones that think the government is God. They're the ones that think that you have to have the government open all the time doing things. You just heard Nancy Pelosi saying right there, people don't understand how important it is for the federal government. What did the federal government do when they shut down the last time? First of all, over 70% of the employees still showed up for work that day. The employees that didn't still got back pay later. And right now, we've already funded the military, so this wouldn't even affect the troops. As far as I'm concerned, we could leave it shut down for a couple months and it would be fine. But the thing is, they're never going to need that because just like Chuck Schumer did in the last shutdown, it will not be long at all before they cave. Democrats cannot stand the idea of government not being active for very long. And so because of that, all the Republicans have to do is sit back and relax. The Democrats will cave very, very quickly. I mean, I'm estimating within about 48 hours. And goodness knows we can go 48 hours with the government being closed. The federal government is closed basically 48 hours every weekend, and we do just fine. And so we'll be perfectly okay, especially in this slow news cycle, if the Republicans just sit back, kick up their feet, and watch the fun. Which, by the way, is exactly the way I have an intention of doing it. One more time, Ron Swanson. That is going to be me if we shut down the government. That being said, we'll go ahead and go straight to the daily dose of stupid.
No, you messed it up. You're stupid.
Today's daily dose of stupid comes to you from someone named Clara Sorrenti. Now, for those of you who are saying, well, who the heck is that? Fair question, because I didn't know her until this news story break. She is an activist in Canada. She lives in Ontario, and she helps organize the Young Communist League. So she's somebody that, no shame, comes out straight up, I'm a communist, I want communist ideas. So, bit of a radical, but just to give you kind of an idea of where she is and where she stands on things, this is a tweet from her the other day, praising Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, saying that they were both great communists whose lives and legacies are worth celebrating. So already you have a pretty good indication this is not somebody that is really subject to logic and reason. She just kind of goes off the deep end. Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, two of the most brutal dictators in all of human history. Oh, they were great communists and their legacies are worth celebrating. Okay. But I guess when you're talking about communism, human misery just isn't a factor, because if it was, then communism wouldn't work. And so you just have to kind of throw caution to the wind when it comes to that one. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people like her around that age in Canada that sort of have this soft, somewhat quiet admiration for people like Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. Some people are actually pretty loud about it. You have the Che Guevara shirts, and you had, I believe it was Justin Trudeau, who's the Prime Minister of Canada now, who was talking about what a great leader Fidel Castro was when he died. So unfortunately, there is this tendency on the left to memorialize brutal dictators who wound up suppressing their opponents and killing their political enemies. So this is the tweet that came from her yesterday. Whether you like it or not, Joseph Stalin was one of the greatest anti-fascists in the history of the anti-fascist movement. Under Stalin's command, the Red Army defeated the Nazis and saved several ethnic groups from Nazi extermination. This is a legacy we cannot forget. Wow. Yeah, there's several things that are a problem with that. First of all, just on its surface, it's a false dichotomy fallacy. You're assuming that because evil opposed another evil, that evil must be good. Look, two forces can oppose each other and neither one of them be good. That is the truth. Because if you're looking at, for example, the Mafia and the Triad do not get along. That does not make either one of them good. You could look, for example, at ISIS and Iran. ISIS and Iran are sworn enemies, but that doesn't make either one of them good guys. This idea that just because two forces are opposed to one another, that one of them must be good and one of them must be bad, yeah, that's bad logic. Just because they happen to oppose one another does not mean that either one of them happened to be the good guys. And another thing that I wanted to bring up is that it's funny to me that you will talk about him being an anti-fascist. Joseph Stalin was an anti-fascist. Well, let's go ahead and look at the definition of fascist, shall we? Because that might help us a little bit with understanding this. So, according to Merriam-Webster, and you've got the two definitions there, fascism is a political philosophy, movement, or regime, such as that of the fascisti, that exalts nation over race, and often race, above the individual and stands for centralized autocratic government headed by a dictatorial leader, severe economic and social regimentation, and forcible suppression of opposition. And then the second one, a tendency toward or actual exercise of strong autocratic or dictatorial control. Okay, can anybody explain to me what part of that definition does not fit Joseph Stalin? Anybody? Anybody? Look through that. A movement or regime, which of course Stalin would have been, that exalts nation and often race above the individual. Okay, well, there's no question that Stalin did that. You could argue not so much race, because they weren't so much about the race of Russia as the nationality of Russia, but nonetheless, they believed it. They called it Mother Russia, for crying out loud. They referred to it as the motherland. They exalted their nation above everyone else and said all these other Slavic countries that have Russian influence, we should be ruling over them, and eventually we should be ruling over the other nations as well. That's why they engaged in conquest. That's why the USSR existed, because they believed their nation was better than everybody else's. And then it stood for an autocratic government headed by a dictatorial leader. Well, I think Stalin pretty clearly would apply there. Stalin was in control of everything. There was nothing that happened in Russia without his stamp of approval. I mean, that's just how it worked under the USSR. Severe economic and social regimentation. Well, that's obviously true. If you know anything about the economics of the USSR, they controlled everything, the means of production, they controlled individual property, and then social regimentation, also certainly true. There were certain people that they favored and certain people that they starved out. If you don't believe me, look at Ukraine. I mean, if you're looking at Ukraine, they systematically starved out 5 million Ukrainians. And they wound up killing 20 million in the USSR overall. That means about a quarter of the people that they killed were in Ukraine. And it was not because Ukraine had a bigger population. There were certain people they favored and certain people they did not. And then forcible suppression of opposition. Yeah, try talking bad about Stalin and seeing how that works out for you. I mean, every aspect of that definition, Stalin falls right into it. And it is hilarious to me that these people that refer to themselves as anti-fascist are just as fascist, if not more so, than the fascists that they claim to be opposing. I mean, Stalin killed 3 to 5 times as many people as Adolf Hitler. And if you want to say, well, he had a much longer reign. Yeah, but he killed about 6,000. Whoa, severely lowballing that. He killed over 6 million in less time than it took for Hitler to kill 6 million in the Holocaust. He systematically starved out millions upon millions of his own people. And people in other countries, like Ukraine. And so, these people are just willfully ignorant of history and assume that their guy is right and the other guy is wrong. But they can both be wrong. Adolf Hitler was a terrible, wicked dictator, who, by the way, was a socialist, because that's what Nazi stands for, National Socialist Worker Party. But nonetheless, just, glossing over that for a second, the idea that because Hitler was bad and Joseph Stalin didn't like him, remember that the reason that Stalin and Hitler had a falling out is because Hitler and he had an agreement that basically he would control that part of the world. And once it was very clear that Hitler had no intention of keeping his word, that's when Stalin turned on him. Basically, he was mad at Hitler for saying that Stalin should have less power. In other words, he was challenging his dictatorial authority over some of the countries near Germany, and that's why they had the falling out. Stalin didn't oppose Hitler because he had some kind of sense of morality, or because Hitler was, he saw him as a moral evil. It was because he saw Hitler as a threat to his own power. So let's not pretend that Stalin, just out of the goodness of his heart, decided to expend the blood and sweat of Russia for anything other than increasing his own power. These people that just do not know their history drives me up a wall. Just like in America, the anti-fascists here are often more oppressive than the people that they claim are too oppressive and that they oppose. So let's go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Okay, Chaplain's Report this morning. Actually, we have two Bible verses that I want to share with you because they do go hand in hand. So the first Bible verse that we'll look at comes from the book of Ephesians. And it's important to note this because these two verses just sort of work together if you understand the background and the legacy of Jesus Christ and the fall of man as well. So let's look at Ephesians 2:14 through 16. For he himself is our peace, who made both groups into one, and which broke down the barrier of the dividing wall, by abolishing his flesh, the enmity which is the law of commandments contained in ordinances, so that in himself he might make the two into one new man, thus establishing peace. And he might reconcile them both in one body to God through the cross, by having put to death the enmity. So this is something that Paul is speaking to, that anybody that's familiar with the plight and the origin of sin should be very familiar with. That because of sin, there is this gulf between us and God. That God is on one side and we're on the other, and there is no way to bridge that gulf. Not until Jesus Christ. There had to be somebody that was willing to come along and to be made into flesh, as the scripture says, to be able to destroy this wall between God and man. And, by the way, it also wound up destroying the barrier between Jews and Greeks, which is one of the things that he's talking about there in Ephesians, is that there was a separation between God's people, the Jews, and the Gentile people. And now that Jesus has died and brought all into one body and reconciled them, then now there is no difference between Jews and Greeks, or Jews and Gentiles, as a more modern translation would use. That we are all one in Christ Jesus. And because of that, we are also able to have fellowship with the Father. That gulf of sin that was separating us, that we could never bridge, that we could never jump across, has now been bridged by Jesus Christ. He becomes the way for us to get to the Father. We needed to become a part of his body so he could become the door that we could enter into and be with the Father once again. So that enmity, that gulf between us, is now no longer there. He has broken through that partition between us and God, and that barrier no longer hinders us from being able to have fellowship with our Father once again. And that is a truly amazing thing, especially when you consider looking at the second Bible verse, which absolutely goes along with it. If you understand the origin of sin, you understand why this was important. Genesis 3:14 and 15, right after the fall of man. The Lord God said to the serpent, because you have done this, cursed are you more than all the cattle, and more than every beast of the field. On your belly you will go, and dust you will eat, and all the days of your life. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. All right, so right here, we already have a prophecy of Jesus Christ. We already know that God has a plan, and his plan is on the way. Think about how absolutely amazing that is. That centuries, millennia before Jesus shows up, God already has a plan in place to get rid of the enmity, to get rid of the sin that is separating him from his creation. He already knows what's going to happen. He already knows what he's going to do. He sees the sin take place, and he says, here's what's going to happen. Through the seed of Eve, in other words, someone who is born of Eve, is going to bruise your head, and you are going to bruise his heel. Well, if you're looking at that in conjunction with the verse that we just read in Ephesians, that somebody had to become flesh by abolishing his flesh in the enmity which is the law contained within the ordinances. So in other words, by the torturing and suffering and the abolishment of his flesh, then all of a sudden, that partition, that enmity, is put to death. It is taken away with it. So our sin is put to death on the cross with Christ. And because it is put to death by Jesus, we now have this bridge to where we can come together with Jesus once again. God had his plan set out way before we would ever have thought about it. He knew this ahead of time, that he was going to have somebody born of Eve, in other words, born of a woman, and going to have them go and put their own flesh to death so that it might be an atonement for our sin, a way to get rid of our evil and allow us to have forgiveness so that we can be one with the Father once again. That is truly amazing when you think about how far ahead God is of everyone else. But if you can see all of time at once, it makes sense. It does go to show you, however, how far God will go to be able to save his people. That he was willing to have Satan bruise his son's heel, as he put it in Genesis, in order that he could bruise his head and bring down the sin that was separating us from one another. And only one that was born of Eve could do that. That's why God had to become flesh, why he had to be born of a woman. He couldn't just beam himself down. He had to actually go through life as a human being and live in the flesh in order to be crucified and to have that sacrifice atoned, because only by putting that flesh to death could our sins also be put to death. That's really the lesson that we're seeing here. And so, really, when you understand that, you really get that God had to be both God and man at once. Jesus had to be both completely God, 100% God, and 100% man as well. He had to be both, because anything less than that, no man could live a perfect life. And no human being could live a human life, and absolutely nothing less than a God would be able to offer that sacrifice to save mankind. And so he had to be both at once. Both someone who was of the offspring of Eve and somebody who was the offspring of God. Stay the course, friends.